Hello, welcome. My name is Edwin Sorensen. I'm the creator of Ctruth, and in this video I provide an audiobook version of Edward Petherick's Edwin Johnson and His Writings, Part 2, found in the beginning of Edwin Johnson's The Rise of English Culture, 1904. A link to the reading can be found in the description to this video. I want to quick thank the Ctruth patrons for their continued support in my endeavor to study and produce Ctruth content, so thank you all. It means a lot to me and lets me know that you want to see more. Without further ado, Edward Petherick's Edwin Johnson and His Writings, Part 2. The main results of Johnson's researches as recorded in his printed writings are briefly these: that the history of Europe, especially ecclesiastical history, is founded largely upon assumption as well as upon tradition, legend, and error, the biographies of real persons being idealized; that the Hebrew and Christian scriptures are proleptic in character; that there was no constituted Christian church before the 11th century of our era, 800 years ago; that the larger part of the so-called Middle Ages is an imaginary or non-existent period, the modern period beginning soon after the breakup of the old Roman Empire. We are therefore not so far removed in time from the Greeks and Romans as our chronological table teaches. Further, Johnson has traced our ecclesiastical system backwards to the Arabians, who owe nothing whatever to Latin or Greek Christianity, the indebtedness being in the opposite direction. Christianity in some form was, however, anterior to all these systems. These are no wild theories to be summarily rejected. Though some of the statements may seem too bold or too arbitrary, the reader will find the author's arguments quite intelligible and not unreasonable. Many have discovered inexplicable anomalies and discrepancies in their reading of history. In Johnson's printed writings they will, I think, find a solution of their difficulties, an explanation of many things hitherto imperfectly or wholly misunderstood, especially of matters in relation to our system of chronology. Our own system of chronology being impugned, I once asked the author, how do we stand in relation to other systems, and suggested that he should make some attempt towards a reconstruction. The notes and memoranda utilized by Mr. Arbuthnot may have been a step in the direction indicated. In the following pages, I have endeavored to bring together some of the anomalies noticed in my own reading. Those given could easily be supplemented by many more in support of our author's arguments. The saying that geography and chronology are the two eyes of history has become so hackneyed an expression that we are apt to forget the rational mind of the observer behind them. Even careful historians write of long stretches of 1,000 and 1,500 years as if historical time was unlimited. The average educated person so easily, in imagination, transfers himself from continent to continent or from century to century and speaks or writes of this or that event as having happened in the 2nd or the 7th or the 19th or any intervening century, as if time had been reckoned in this manner all through the era. Speaking generally, no ancient era was in use or in force from its commencement, nor till long afterwards. The term Anno Domini, and the reckoning backwards to the supposed beginning of the era, has been in general use less than 400 years. Before that time, reckoning was by the reigns of kings and princes and popes. Indeed, our Acts of Parliament are still dated by the year of the reign of the king. Inscriptions and manuscripts, when undated, are allocated to particular centuries by the paleographical expert, who ascertains the dates from the language, or contents, or the style of the calligraphy, which may perhaps have been due to the caprice of the writers. Accordingly, when we meet with statements that any Christian document belongs to the period between the 2nd and the 10th century, we may assume that the date given is merely conjectural. Too much emphasis cannot therefore be laid upon this subject of chronology, for upon it rests the credibility and authenticity of church records and the true date of the church's foundation. Like other ecclesiastical eras, the Christian era has been much exaggerated, antedated. A chronological table being necessary, a Dionysius Exiguus was found. The scheme of 14 or 15 anterior centuries being laid down, Christian historians, like Christian geographers who, with savage pictures, filled their maps, and o'er unhabitable downs placed elephants for want of towns, very soon filled up the vacant plan with names and edifying deeds of ecclesiastical princes, churchmen, and saints, or of their supposed opponents, for history to the Christian writers was allegory rather than a science of observation or of reasoning. Glancing over the period between the 4th and 11th centuries, we see that it is spaced out with Christian and ecclesiastical matters, or of secular matter which interested the church. For purely secular names, we look in vain. Between Galen and Ptolemy in the 2nd and the Arabians of the 9th, there is a blank. Speaking of Ptolemy, one is reminded that his geography of the 2nd and that of the 13th centuries are almost alike. The 11 centuries of the Eastern Empire, from Constantine to the fall of Constantinople, are filled up by Byzantine historians, a long unbroken chain. Their writings form a part of the world's annals, which has long been held up to contempt as the record of 1,000 years of moral and political emptiness. The glowing pen of a Gibbon has failed to create an interest in the lives and deeds of a long succession of bloodthirsty tyrants and impotent debauchees. Finley and Freeman would dwell upon the nobler characteristics of the period, the deeds of Belisarius, Heraclius, Leo, the Isaurian, and other individuals, largely idealized and of uncertain date. But while we read, we cannot lose sight of the scribes, who think the same thoughts and write the same language, which does not alter in 1,000 years. To borrow the expression of one of Johnson's correspondents, they all use the same pen and ink. Throughout these chronicles of corruption, calamity, crime, supposed to be incident to a decaying empire, no link is lost. The long drawn-out story as we have it was probably written after the Turks had entered into possession. Writing of another supposed Christian people, the Ethiopians, Gibbon says of them, they slept near 1,000 years, forgetful of the world by whom they were forgotten. Christian Coptic contrasts strongly with Old Coptic. Of China, known to the Romans, it may be said with as much reason as of Abyssinia, that she was also forgotten by Europe for a similar period. We have no notices of China between the time of Arrian and Ptolemy and the mission of Carpini in 1246, but there are seeming references in Chinese records to the Roman Empire at a comparatively recent period when, according to the Orthodox chronology, it had long been dead and buried. In India, as in China, chronology is in an unsettled state. India has no history properly so-called before the Mohammedan invasion in the 13th century. In Mr. Lane Poole's Medieval India, 1903, the period of several centuries between the Arab conquest of Sind and the Mohammedan invasion occupies less than 2 pages. He says, the Arab conquest led to nothing, and left scarcely a vestige. The Arab cities have perished, but the wrecks of the castles and cities of their predecessors still bear witness to the civilization which they uprooted. Was there an Arab period such as that hitherto represented? Not one of her races or small nationalities ever kept a chronicle. A learned philologer notices the absence of written memorials or literature or data by which to trace the current popular speech during a dark age, a long night of 9 centuries. The curtain falls on Indian languages about the 1st century and does not rise again until the 10th. I very much doubt, he continues, whether the intervening space will ever be filled up. The materials seem to be lost forever. Buddhism is our only chance. There seems to be no more to hope for. And these 9 centuries must remain forever a sealed book. This state of things is reported of a country to which Europe is indebted for her figures and arithmetic and for some of her religious ideas, a country wherein the priestly and writing order has never died out. The age of most Hindu writings is unknown, and the authors are themselves merged in nirvana. There is no hope, however, of Buddhist records furnishing material for the long night. Maisie is inclined to reduce the Buddhist period by 600 years, while Ferguson would place the Buddha Gaya buildings, alleged to be of the 1st century BC, in the 14th century AC. Material of the most meager character covers a corresponding Dark Age in Persian history, material, apparently, of Arabic, not Persian literature. The Benedictine, or Christian chronology, seems therefore to be as little applicable to African and Oriental civilizations as to those of Europe. When our conventional 1900 years is applied to Abyssinia, to India, to Persia, the history of each of these countries shows a similar gap or night, extending over many centuries, gaps which cannot be bridged by any contemporary records. While the ancient and modern periods are filled with authentic records, more or less perfect, the middle or so-called medieval period is fabulous, or occupied with attenuated matter borrowed from the earlier and later periods. The historians of Christianity tell us of heresiarchs, of apologists, of defenders of church doctrines, and of councils convened to settle difficulties. These councils began early and have continued all through the ages covered by the church history. They were at one time so frequent that bishops and clergy had, one would suppose, little else to do except to prepare for and attend them. We read of councils in Asia Minor, councils in Germany, councils in France, councils in all part of the empire. In Africa, the church found its most zealous confessors of the faith and its most gifted defenders. Tertullian and Cyprian, Arnobius and Lactantius, and the greatest of all churchmen, Augustine, were natives of Africa. It was through Africa that Christianity became the religion of the world. In North Africa, at one time, there were no fewer than 600 bishops' sees. At the Council of Carthage, St. Augustine led 286 Orthodox bishops, Petalanus 279 Donatists. Explorers, as well as historians, inform us that while the Romans have left enduring marks and a wealth of inscriptions in North Africa, Christianity has left none, and is completely extirpated. The only explanation is that Augustine and the other confessors and their church councils are myths. Strange to say, these Africans wrote in Greek, while Latin was the language generally spoken. But, as the latest writer on Roman Africa, the Greek was not the Greek of Aeschylus or of Sophocles. It possessed an originality that was remarkable. It was the barbarous Greek of the monks of the Middle Ages, when Christian writers were most prolific and most ignorant. The great number of manuscripts of the New Testament still in existence, more than 3,000, besides the very large number of versions, as compared with the few scores of copies, often less, of the classical writers, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Thucydides, Horace, Lucretius, Tacitus, and many more, has been adduced to show how immensely superior is the position of the New Testament. Does this not tend rather to show its more recent origin? If there has been a careful regard for New Testament documents, how is it that the Old Testament documents were not preserved? That the New Testament writings are more recent than the classical is evidenced by the palimpsests. The most valuable texts of classical authors are overwritten by Syriac and Greek Christian texts. Christian texts underlying classical texts are of late date. To come to Rome itself, the Eternal City is her own witness. In The Rise of Christendom, Johnson has commented on the absence of authentic papal coins older than the 12th century, while Mr. Arbuthnot, after a search through the museums of Europe, came to the decision that there are no authentic papal records earlier than AD 1198. The historians of architecture mark the 11th and 12th centuries as the commencement of cathedral building in Italy, France, and England. There are no earlier remains of any ecclesiastical buildings in this country, and on the continent they succeed the Roman temples and palaces without a break. The latest editor of Gibbon tells us that the study of Byzantine architecture has not yet begun. 40 years ago, an eminent historian and statesman, happily still with us, observed that the modern traveler, after his first few days in Rome, begins to seek for relics of the 1200 years that lie between Constantine and Pope Julius II. Where, he asks, is the Rome of the Middle Ages? To this question, the writer adds, there is no answer. The historian of the Holy Roman Empire is again in Rome as I write, April 1903, attending a congress of historians. Does Mr. Bryce see more today than he saw during his former visit? I think not, for the late Mr. Freeman was similarly impressed. Aware of the continuity and unity of history, he noticed in Rome a gap, a wider gulf between the great periods of history than can be found anywhere else, a yawning gap indeed. At the first glance, Rome seems to be rich in monuments of the early days of her emperors and of the later days of her pontiffs, and to have little to show of any other intermediate age. The intelligent reader will remind me that underground are the witnesses, the catacombs. What, he may ask, of the Christian martyrs in the 10 great persecutions? The answer to this question is an easy one. The catacombs are the graveyards of the Roman people. The story of persecutions of anybody of believers in the capital of the Roman world. The government and rule of which was the most free and tolerant known to us is a libel and is inconceivable. That Marcus Aurelius, the most perfect man that ever lived, should have permitted the torment and murder of Christian men and women for a belief as harmless as his own, is a charge for which there is no evidence, and it must be dismissed. In the catacombs, disused early in the 5th and reopened towards the end of the 16th century, the same writers who give us incredible church history see in the cross and other Roman and pre-Roman symbols emblems of Christianity. In the innumerable inscriptions B.M., which to those who had sorrowed for the department stood for Bene Merenti or Bona Memoria, equivalent to our own blessed or affectionate memory. They saw another meaning, and in some unexplained manner these initial letters were taken to mean blessed martyr, and extending over long periods there grew up the belief in 10 great persecutions. There is a story of the catacombs having been visited in the 4th century by St. Jerome when a boy. He used to make the circuit of the sepulchres of the apostles and martyrs on Sundays, but Jerome writes like a 16th century scholar. More, when he translated the Old Testament, used the 16th century signs for punctuation, 1,000 years before they came into general use. It is also to be noticed that some of his works are of a late period and written over older authors, palimpsest. Some of the Christian literature may have been composed as themes for discussion and disputation, the disputants using assumed names, merging themselves in a sort of nirvana, like Buddhist writers. This would explain the origin of much of the proleptic writing, the authors little suspecting that in after ages it would be taken as inspired. Some of the works of St. Augustine would come into this category. One man at that time could scarcely have written all that is now attributed to him. The Confessions is not an autobiography, but a spiritual matter. Its style is that of the Imitation of Christ of the 14th or 15th century, and the progress of Augustine from Neoplatonism through Manichaeism into Christianity is typical of the growth of Christianity itself. In The City of God, designed to inaugurate a new order of things, the writer brought into clear light the distinction between the kingdoms of greed and power, and that of righteousness and truth, as far as he knew it. Edification rather than truth must be looked for in ecclesiastical writings. The scribes of that period wrote not for a critical or skeptical age in a distant future. In the scriptorium, they could take cognizance only of such material as they collected in their neighborhood, legendary or traditional, or of the Oriental theology and literature, the wild, the marvelous, the incredible, not infrequently the indecent, which edified or amused the European peoples from the 12th to the 16th century. The nobler class of men in the monasteries lived, in a sense, a beautiful life, which could have ended only in a state of nirvana. Believing in the transitoriness of this world, their hope was fixed upon another. This one, they argued, was very evil. The time was waxing late. Their duty was, they thought, to be sober and keep vigil, for the judge was at the gate. The first Christian missionaries were much surprised to find evidence of Christianity among the Tartars. They discovered Nestorians and Jews in China as well as in India. Certain tablets and inscriptions must have been forged, say some skeptics, but monasteries, processions, pilgrimages, festivals, a pontifical court, and colleges of clergy are found all through the historical period, and all ecclesiastical systems, Christian, Mohammedan, Buddhist, Lamaistic, doubtless have a common origin. Isaac Taylor, in his Ancient Christianity, 1840, traced monasticism to India, and Buddhism is believed to have established itself in Alexandria. Gnosticism was anterior to Christianity and open to Indian influence. Romanism, Nestorianism, and Musulmanism all have one source, and are derived from Brahmanism and Buddhism. The word paradise and the idea of the resurrection are Persian in their origin. The Magi, or Parsis, claim Abraham as their prophet and reformer, and he is identified with Zoroaster in Mohammedan writings. Mohammedanism is indebted to Zendavesta, but not to the Christian scriptures. The latter, as Johnson has shown, is indebted to the Quran. We do not find a single ceremony or doctrine of Islam in the smallest degree molded or even tinged by the peculiar tenets of Christianity. There is no evidence that Mohammed had any practical acquaintance with the Old or New Testament scriptures. The Quran knows nothing of Paul or of his doctrines. The Quran recognizes Jesus as a divine messenger and will be found to approach more closely the doctrines of Jesus than those of Paul. This again confirms Johnson in his solution of the enigma of the Pauline teaching in the New Testament. Again, the reader may ask, do not the city of Jerusalem and the Holy Land witness to the historical truth of the Bible? Johnson shows that the narratives in the Old and New Testament have come to us through Arabian and Persian chronicles, that the name of Jerusalem is a poetical one like that of Mount Zion, that the city now called Jerusalem was known to the Arabs as Aelia Capitolina of the Romans. The Holy Land of the Old Testament must be looked for elsewhere than in Palestine. The Holy Land of the Old Testament must be looked for elsewhere than in Palestine. The Holy Land of the New Testament Johnson found in southern Italy. Mount Sinai, Professor Sayce informs us, has not yet been correctly identified. It is not in the peninsula, which is now called Sinaitic. The Jewish chronological system is quite modern. There is no satisfactory account of an ancient Jewish chronological system, and the modern Jewish era was not known before the 14th century AD. The Hebrews were a sect among the Arabs in Spain, and their own writings, as distinct from the historical portions now held sacred, contain internal evidence of a recent and local origin. The prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah, with the Lamentations, Obadiah, etc., were written during the troublous persecutions of the Jews in modern times, and partake of a local coloring. Ford and other travelers in the north of Spain have remarked upon the likeness of that country to the Palestine of Scripture. I thought myself, wrote Beckford, suddenly transported to Palestine. One of the charges made against Servetus was that he had impugned the scripture geography as applied to Palestine, the land of the Philistines. One of the charges made against Servetus was that he had impugned the scripture geography as applied to Palestine, the land of the Philistines. For more than 40 years, explorers have been searching for Hebrew inscriptions in Palestine. Other inscriptions have been found there in abundance, but not a single Hebrew word. The Moabite stone, if authentic, would have been the oldest known specimen of alphabetic writing in Western Asia. This is too great a demand upon our credulity. It proves too much, and thus shows its falsity. The inscription at the Pool of Siloam cannot be Hebrew. The oldest Hebrew writing at present known is generally referred to our so-called 8th or 9th century AD. 1800 or 1900 years later than the alleged age of the Moabite stone. Square Hebrew, Conder writes, is scarcely older than Jerome's time, whenever that was, and the Hebrew points have an equally insignificant antiquity. To get over this difficulty, another eminent scholar suggests that the Old Hebrew died out and that a kind of survival of it exists in the Judeo-German and Judeo-Spanish jargons. If we accept the so-called Orthodox history, we are to believe that while the literature of Egypt, of Assyria, of the Hittites, and of other peoples has been locked up for 2,000 or 3,000 years, that of Israel has always been available. No, the truth appears to be with Johnson. The Hebrew literature is modern literature. All our information about Hebrew books from the Hebrews themselves is 16th century information. The tales of Palestinian and Babylonian schools are but tales. Some have supposed that Hebrew was the parent of Arabic or a sister language. One of the most ancient and most widely circulated books is the Fables of Bidpai. The translations came to Europe from Sanskrit through the Arabic. From the Arabic it was rendered into Greek, into Persian, into Hebrew, and into Spanish, from the Hebrew into Latin, and from the Latin into German, Italian, French, English, Danish, and Dutch. This seems to indicate that Arabic is older than Hebrew. Robertson Smith has told us that in grammatical structure, Arabic comes nearer than Hebrew to the original Semitic. Arabic represents the original wealth and primitive subtlety of Semitic speech. Arabic is singularly copious and possesses a vocabulary which rivals, if it does not exceed, that of any other language in extant, and is more fully developed than any other Semitic tongue. Hebrew is a comparatively poor language. The earliest European Arabic scholars claimed for Arabic that its study was the only true road to the understanding of the Hebrew. The word Hebrew has never been found in the early monuments of other Eastern nations. Not one Hebrew inscription of the age of the Jewish monarchy has come down to us. For more than 300 years, the holy sites, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Golgotha, etc., have been characterized as frauds, scandalous cheats, and forgeries. A late traveler has recorded his conviction that the giant cities in Bashan are an illusion. It is not of Og, but of Antonines, not of the Israelitish, but of the Saracenic conquest, that he is reminded. But we have Josephus, suggests the reader. The Antiquity of the Jews is a compilation from the Oriental Chronicles. The narrative of the Wars of the Jews is a piece of fiction which carries on every page its refutation as history. Like the works of St. Augustine, Lactantius, and others of the fraternity, that of Josephus is in Greek. In one place, the writer says that the things told by the Jews who surrendered in the siege of Jerusalem only he understood. The story has no special local coloring and may be reminiscent of the period of the Crusades, the wars between East and West, not for a cross or sepulchre, but for the rule of the world. The Church of Rome, in the words of Johnson, was founded in a time of darkness, wrath, and dismay, and the sole apology for the misdeeds of the founders of her temporal sway lies in the fact that it was at a time when violence alone reigned in the earth. If Johnson is correct in his surmise that the breaking up of the old Roman Empire immediately preceded the modern period, then the remark of Macaulay that, in Britain, only an age of fable separates two ages of truth, will apply also to the history of Europe. That concludes Edward Petherick's Edwin Johnson and his writings, Part 2. Thank you for watching. Like the video, subscribe, comment, and never stop seeking the truth about chronology.